Test. Can you guys hear me? Test, test. Is it in? Test. 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 Huh? I thought we turned it on, but maybe not.
Yeah, it should be.
Test. Yeah. All right. Test. Test. Okay, I think we're wired for sound now. All right, Ecclesiastes. So, we'll start. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers. Hopefully you've got a fun day ahead. A little pampering. So we got into parts of chapter 4 last week. Let's just do a quick overview and take a look at what we did last week. So we finished out chapter 3 where Solomon talks about how God has made everything beautiful in its time. God sees the whole picture. We do not. We just talked about, sometimes things are frustrating or we can't see what's going on or understand the reason for things, and that's because we can't see the larger picture. We talked about injustice and oppression again, and that God will set things right in his time. And we saw somewhere when man moves away from justice and righteousness, he becomes more like the animals, and Solomon spent some time talking about that. Then as we got into chapter 4, he talks about oppression, envy of our neighbor, and the man all alone. He kind of goes into the principle that 2 are better than 1, 3 are even better than that, and that life lived in community and mutual interdependence is better all around for everyone. This is how God designed us to flourish. And so that's kind of where we were. So let's pick up in chapter 4, beginning at verse 13. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw all that who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were before them, but those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And so as he gets into this section, we seem to be transitioning from discussing the deceitfulness of riches to maybe even like the fleeting popularity even for someone who's the king. And it's just another example that he's sharing that about life lived under the sun is futile, no matter who you are, whether you're the king, whether you're rich. He's going to continue that theme. So Solomon shares the example of a poor but wise youth who assumes leadership of the land from a old and foolish king, and talks about how first he's praised and then later forgotten when someone else becomes a successor. And so it's yet like another example of the pattern of futility from one generation to the next. In this chain of succession, no one gets lasting benefit from the exercise of power. So Solomon uses some extremes here, and he's done this in other examples that he's given us. The youth is poor, he's in prison, yet he's wise. The king is old, the king is foolish and set in his ways. But he's kind of making the point that the country will be better served by youth than the king. It doesn't necessarily mean that the youth became king because of his wisdom, or because he was extra crafty or extra cunning in terms of how he got there. It's more about the fact that the land is better off with a youth who's wise than a king who's grown foolish. And he uses these extremes and kind of shows us that to illustrate that one can rise from unlikely circumstances to become king, to supplant the person who already has control, but it demonstrates the lack of security in life. Even in the biggest office in the land, it doesn't necessarily grant you extra security, or that you'll have your moment in the sun, but that too will fade. And that's kind of what verse 15 gets to, the fact that the new king will have his moment in the spotlight, have his popularity, but that moment's going to fade. People will be fickle, and that moment in the spotlight will fade. And so it's, things are good when they're good, and then after a while, things change. Verse 16, he says, at one point he'll have multitudes by his side, they'll all be singing his praises, but the next generation's going to come, and they're not going to be happy or satisfied with him. And so there'll be a change again. Now, you can look at these, and there's some people that look at these and say, is this prophetic and seeing fulfillment of Solomon's death and the coming of Jeroboam to reign over the 10 tribes to the north? If that's the case, Solomon would be the old foolish king. Jeroboam is the one who comes out of prison. And you'd say, well, was Jeroboam in prison? Well, not literally, but figuratively, because Jeroboam had an exile to Egypt, and then after his exile, he comes back and later becomes king. I think there's an evident parallel here. I'm not sure you can make a strong argument against that interpretation, but I don't know that that's really the point here. I'd say the important thing to take away in the lesson, or is the lesson around futility of life, that, even the king, it's good for a while, but someone else is going to come, take your place. They'll be the popular person. Someone will come along and take their place. Even being king doesn't necessarily get you any advantage. So with that, let's move to chapter 5. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near and listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know that they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. A dream comes when there are many cares, and many words mark the speech of a fool. So he starts us off by saying, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. If we paraphrase this, we might kind of say, watch your step when you come to the temple. Remember, it's God's house. Now, I think there's both kind of a literal and a figurative way we can look at this. Literally, a person needed to slow down and watch where they were going because of the uneven distance between each step. They tell us that the southern steps leading to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem were intentionally created with offset steps of 12 inches and 35 inches so that greater care was required when a person ascended to the entrance of the temple. So if you were a worshiper going to the temple, just the physical aspect of how they built those steps would require you to slow down, contemplate where you were going. In a figurative sense, I think he's really talking about, we need to examine our heart. We need to look at our motives as we go into worship. And you look at this and you say, well, why has Solomon kind of inserted this here? And I think you can look at it and say it's perhaps a warning about hypocritical worship. Things that on the outside look good, giving the right outward appearance, but the inward man doesn't really match what maybe we're seeing on the outside. And if we ask ourselves questions, we apply it to us. Do we gather just like we gather at other places, just to hear, to sit, to talk, and then to leave? And so you think about when we come together, we go to different places. We go to movies, we go to plays, we go to school events, we go to sporting events. Do we approach coming together to assemble with a different attitude, with a different mindset? Or is it kind of the same thing? We're going to go there, we'll have a seat, we're going to listen, we're going to talk to some folks, and then it's time to go. So, something to think about. When we're out of step with God, we're out of step with one another. And so did Solomon put this here to show how when we're out of step with God, it leads to examples of injustice and inequity that he's been talking about, and continues to speak to later in the book. You know, perhaps we wonder why he did insert it here. He's been talking a lot about oppression. He's been talking about the injustice, where men get off track, where men, you know, essentially, as they get further away from God, have to ask yourself, are they much different than animals? Is that why he put this here? He goes on and says, go near and listen. Paraphrase might be, approach the house of God with a spirit that prepares your heart to be slow to speak but swift to hear. Don't be too quick to tell God what you think he wants to hear. And so you think about just the importance of listening, to, you know, not having a lot to say, but just listening to what God is speaking to us about. Yeah, you might, you know, if you're thinking about it, you might think of a very similar statement in Deuteronomy 6:4, where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." You know, there's probably some that would say listening should be our main spiritual discipline. The Hebrew here conveys the idea of taking heed and following the will and the ways of the Lord. So he's talked about, you know, be careful as you come in. He's talking a little bit about the attitude. And then as we come in to the temple, he's talking about listen. Listen to it. Take heed. Be willing to follow the ways of the Lord. He starts referencing the fool in this section. And this isn't the first time that he's used this example, but and he's not saying the person's a fool because he's coming to the temple to worship, but he's a fool because he doesn't come to listen, but to talk. We've seen Solomon use the word before, and again, it suggests really more about stupidity and ignorance rather than evil. He's not talking about somebody who's wicked, but really somebody who doesn't have common sense or the ability to do things correctly. That's the idea he's trying to convey here when he's talking about the fool. What does he say about the fool? He says, the fool fails to listen to God. He offers an unacceptable sacrifice. He's ignorant of his own evil activities. And he's hasty and impulsive in his speech. He fails to remember that he is the created one and God is the creator. And so again, it all kind of meshes together here with the thought about how we approach what our attitude should be in worship. He talks about sacrifice here. It really doesn't seem to be talking about a sacrifice of blood or some kind of physical sacrifice. The context would lead us to believe he's talking about words. Words hastily and impulsively offered to God. It could be things like promises which can't be kept, meaningless chatter, empty words that don't come from the heart, vain repetitions. And so that's probably more of what we're talking about in that section. And the last part there, a dream comes when there are many cares. Solomon says that many cares, concerns are what cause us to dream. Dreams come from overwork. And so the context here suggests it's an illustration, and a good illustration for us because that's common to us. Because if you think about it, I don't know about you, I find that if I'm thinking way too much about work, I start dreaming about work, or I have a hard time falling asleep because I'm playing scenarios out in my mind. So he's trying to give us here an illustration here that the readers can understand. And he's basically saying it's as natural for the fool to be verbose as it is for dreams to come to those who toil pointlessly for gain. And so to make his point about many words, and our words should be few, Kidner also says he could be referring to daydreams. And so that's another way you could look at this. I don't know that I saw a lot of people who had that same take, but that was one of the scholars thought that he could be referencing daydreams there. So at the end of the day, he's basically saying, keep your words few, mean what you say, don't play the part of a fool, and negate your act of worship. So I'll pause here. We've gone through a couple of sections. Any comments or thoughts before we move on? Okay. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It's better not to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin. And do not protest to the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore fear God. So in the first three verses that we just covered, Solomon has addressed the right attitude or approach to worship, the importance of listening, keeping our words few, which he now connects to what he shares about making vows. You know, we don't live in the same context of vows that Solomon did, but the principle is there. Basically, do what we say we're going to do, and God remembers what we said. You know, be accountable. If you say you're going to do it, be accountable for what you did. And so you think about those situations where we kind of get ourselves in a jam, or we back ourselves up into a corner. Think about how we usually pray in situations like that. Some of the things we say we'll do, the promises we make, you know, God, if you get us out of this, or if you see us through this, here's what we're going to do, here's what, you know, I promise I'll be, or here's what I'm going to change about myself when we do that. And then human nature takes over. We get through the crisis, and the crisis passes, and we forget all about that. And that just seems to kind of get pushed to the side. But in the moment of crisis, you know, we're making all kinds of promises and things that we're gonna do. So why do we have vows and oaths? Well, basically because man is untruthful. You know, if we told the truth and we could be trusted, we wouldn't have to do that. But we seem to have incorporated vows and oaths and different things. And it's interesting because while those were so common in the day, they weren't necessarily commands of God to do all the things that the Jews and the people of the time did. He doesn't seem to be against it necessarily, but there seems to be a lot of things they added and put in there. You know, we tend to shave off some of the edges about what really happened. We shade some of the details when we're telling things. You know, I think kind of the classic example is if you've ever sold a car and it's got a few issues, you know, it's like, you know, you talk to people, it's like, Summer's like, well, that's kind of like buyer beware. I'm not going to point out every single thing that's wrong with the car. Others say, no, that's dishonest. If you're a Christian, you should be completely transparent about everything that's going on with the vehicle and stuff like that, and you don't know what to trust. If you've bought a car lately, or used car, you know, look at all the tools we have to have online now. It's like, you know, you want to see the records, and they've got, if you go on, is it Carfax, Carfox, whatever that is, you know, and you see all the different, here's all the maintenance, you can see what was done, you can tell if the car was in an accident before, you can tell if it was a serious accident or those things, you know, why do we have things like that? Because people don't tell you that, you know. Has somebody been messing with the odometer? You can see that. Why? Because people do dishonest things, you know, people just, those things, and so that seems to be our nature. Think about how we talk sometimes, how we preface things, you know, and I don't think it's meant with bad intent, but we kind of fall into the trap of saying, well, honestly, as if it was, you know, are your normal comments not honest? You know, to tell you the truth, I'm telling you the truth when I'm telling you this, or, you know, well, really, I'm serious, no lie. And so we have it all kind of like built into our language, into our conversations, because, you know, at the heart of it, people are deceitful. So Solomon's telling us, if you think it's bad not to do something, then how much worse is it not to do it after you've promised God that you'll do it? Because then you'd be better off not making that vow if you're not going to carry through with this. So the principle here is when you speak to God, when you speak to others, really simplicity safeguards your sincerity. When you make it more complicated, when you add on all these other layers, you just make it messier. When we're simply honest, we don't have to resort to vows or oaths. We can be people without flowery pretense, without angles and edges that need to be negotiated by others. We can just be people, it's like what you see is what you get. And people would know us for that. He goes on to say, and do not protest the temple messenger. My vow was a mistake. Kind of like another way of saying, oh, I didn't really mean that. I wasn't serious when I said that. It's interesting, the word messenger there. In some versions, your version may call it angel. There is some thought that that's a better translation. Others feel like in the context of what he's talking about, it makes more sense that he's talking about the messenger in the temple, or in other words, the priest. So there's a couple different thoughts on who the messenger, but In essence, he's saying the messenger is only a representative between the person and God. You made the vow to God, so complaining to the messenger that what is a mistake is not really going to get you anywhere. That's between you and God. Don't expect the messenger to step in and give you some relief. Verse 7 kind of summarizes things. There's nothing good in empty prayers and empty vows. Instead, fear God. Kind of breaks it down real simple. Fear God. In wisdom literature, like Ecclesiastes is, to fear God usually meant doing good and moving away from evil. So again, very solid advice here. Move away from evil, get yourself far away from that, do good. Solomon has a way of kind of taking us to very simple things. Do good, tell the truth, keep your word, be accountable. So at this point in this little section, Solomon has kind of wrapped up his thoughts about formalistic worship and its futility. He points us towards a positive emphasis. In other words, the better way to go is to fear God. And so that's kind of his little section on worship. Any thoughts or comments before we keep moving? Okay. If you see the poor oppressed in a district and justice and rights denied, do not be surprised at such things. For one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them both are others higher still. The increase from the land is taken by all. The king himself profits from the fields. So here we see Solomon has come back again to talking about the oppressed and injustices. And he's done this in a couple different places. He kind of digressed there. We heard the thing about his takes on worship. Now he's coming back again to this, although this time he's got a little bit more of a political slant to it. And perhaps there's some tie-in to the wealth and money stuff that he started talking about in verse 10. And I say that as if you think about those with money tend to be the ones who end up taking charge of things, taking charge of a territory or a property or land or a state, or you might even say a country at times. Those with money tend to be the leaders. They're often the best educated, the most influential. They end up being the people that gain control of things like money, land, politics, government, etc. And so it makes it hard and intimidating for the poor because they don't have the means or the authority to champion their own cause. So there's some thought here that he could also be going this direction, or some of his comments may be tied to all the conversation he's had about wealth and riches and the problems with that, and that may be part of his tie-in. I don't know. But Solomon says, don't be surprised, don't be amazed, don't be astonished that this is happening. He's not telling us not to be concerned. He's just saying, you really shouldn't be surprised that this goes on. He's told us all along there's evil throughout everything. People don't tell the truth. Money corrupts people. So why are we surprised when we see some of this? It's clear that certain evils are common throughout the land at this time. We would say the same thing. It's clear that certain evils still exist in our world today. But he also kind of seems to be pointing us to the rest of this verse 8 and into verse 9. He says, for one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them both are others higher still. And it kind of implies a line of authority or the system, the pyramid, however you want to look at it. It's like there's all these layers. And so there's some question of what's he trying to get across to us here? What's the idea? Is he saying that they're all corrupt? That, I'm being corrupt to the poor because the person over me is extorting me and being corrupt in his dealings with me, and the person over them is being corrupt, and it just kind of goes up the chain? That's one thought. Does it mean that one official is protected by another, and they're protected by higher officials over them? Kind of the system, the code, everybody's got everybody's back, and that's kind of how that works. So you're really never going to make any progress or get any traction because they're all covering for other in this corrupt system that they've got. So are we surprised when we've got a pyramid of unprincipled evil people in control and watching over and protecting each other? It's like, kind of goes back to his point. Don't be surprised that that's going on. There's a reference to the king in verse 9. The Hebrew here is just a little bit ambiguous. Some believe that's a reference to God, that God will bring ultimate justice. And that's in harmony with some of the things that we've been reading, is that, God in his time will take care of the injustice and the oppression. So that's one example. Others interpret this section as every one of the corrupt officials is on the take, even the king. And so that's another view. They watch out for each other because they're all recipients of the produce of the land. So basically saying the corruption goes all the way up the chain, even the king, because I tried to call it a kickback, but he's getting something out of this too. Everybody up the chain's getting something out of it, even the king. So you'd think, could I go to the king for justice? Could I go for the king for relief? He's basically saying in this interpretation. Well, no, because he's part of it. You look at that and you try to have some perspective. Tyranny in itself isn't good, but it may be preferable to anarchy. And even though we may not like the evils of a bureaucratic government or bureaucratic society, it's still better than no government at all or rule of the mob. So he's not necessarily saying it's great, but it's better than the alternative in a lot of cases. Let's keep going here. Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owners except to feast their eyes on them? The sleep of the laborer is sweet, whether they eat little or much. But as for the rich, their abundance permits them no sleep. So you think about it, as we've gone through Ecclesiastes, in a lot of these places, Solomon will start a new section by saying something like, I turned to consider, I looked again. He doesn't say that right here. So it's not really a new subject or a new illustration. It's Solomon coming back to the meaninglessness of all things as it's demonstrated through the love for money and the love for possessions. And he's talked about this before. He talked about it in chapter 2 and he talked about it in chapter 4. And we're going to see it here again. So he talks about the man who loves money, who loves abundance. And again, we want to just point out that he doesn't say it's the man who possesses love or has abundance. He says it's the man who loves wealth, who loves abundance. And again, satisfaction is not found in either or both. In a lot of ways, he's saying it's like an addiction. You can never get enough, and at the end of the day, they're both meaningless. And if you really think about, I don't know what examples you might have in your life. In my company, we have people that do sales, and I would say the woman that's our number one salesperson probably works herself to the bone, but I don't know that she's ever satisfied. It's like once she hits one milestone, she's on to the next milestone, and how do I get bigger, and how do I make more? When you work in a company, have you ever had coworkers say, they really pay me too much money. They really shouldn't pay me this much money. You ever met anybody like that? I've met one person. But he didn't give the money back. He kept the paychecks, and I remember at the time, you remember that if somebody says that to you, it's like, oh, they really pay me more than they should. So, well, haven't ever heard anybody say that, and I haven't heard anybody say that since. So even for ourselves, don't you most of the time, you feel pretty good till something gets your attention. It's like, wow, maybe are they really paying me enough? Maybe I should be making more money. I don't know. So, as critical as we are of some people, again, that's another part of human nature. Are we ever satisfied? If I had told you, okay, look at you, you're gonna have $1 million in your 401k when you retire. It's like, would you feel pretty good about that? Well, you might say, but then you keep thinking, it's like, yeah, but wouldn't it be better to have 2 million? Is that enough? Or is 2 million enough? And what about these people that win the lottery and keep playing the lottery? It's like, did you not get enough money the first time? Why do you keep playing the lottery? What do you, was that not enough? And so, you see it all around us. Yeah. To feast their eyes on them. It's basically saying, look, the one benefit these folks can have is being able to look on or behold their possessions, but they may not be able to enjoy them. And you talk, it's like that's really about the only thing they can do. They can kind of look at all their possessions and maybe, I don't know if it's right to say get some pleasure out of it, but they can do that, but they may never be able to enjoy them because he's talked about all the things that make it hard for those that are wealthy to really enjoy those things. Solomon speaks about two disadvantages of the rich, or of riches, I guess. The more you gather, the more people you need to look after your possessions, and you essentially become a provider of the necessities of life for others to enjoy your wealth who haven't worked like you did. So yeah, it's great, but you keep doing these things, you're going to have more people. You have to bring on more people, employ more people, have more people to help get all this stuff done because you can't do it, because your house is too big, so you have to have all these people to take care of the lawn and take care of the house and do all these things, and all these cars. Who's going to take care of all these cars for you, and who's going to watch all your livestock and do all of these things? It just brings other things with it. If you look like in 1 Kings 5, it's talking about one of Solomon's endeavors, and it gives like some of his employee count, for lack of a better word. For that particular project, 30,000 laborers, 70,000 transporters, 80,000 stone hewers, and 3,300 chief deputies to oversee the work. So just even in some of his massive projects and undertakings, look at all the people that he had to employ that came with that. The other disadvantage, he says, is restful sleep is taken from you. It's almost like Solomon stops for a minute and says, the lowest, most humble person in all of my employ enjoys a night's rest more than I do. So the worker's hard labor gives him the gift of sound sleep, but the rich man's full belly, or his worries about his possessions, keeps him awake. It's kind of like this interesting little chain. More money equals more people equals more worries equals less sleep. So, again, another one of the ironies of wealth. And I don't know about you, but Solomon has not done a whole lot in Ecclesiastes so far to make having money or a lot of money sound real appetizing, has he? I've seen a grievous evil under the sun, wealth hoarded to the harm of its owners, or wealth lost through some misfortune, so that when they have children, there's nothing left for them to inherit. Everyone comes naked from their mother's womb, and as everyone comes, so they depart. They take nothing from their toil that they can carry in their hands. Solomon speaks about a rich man who hoarded his wealth, and in his attempt to increase it or gain more profit, grow his money, he seems to have come across some kind of misfortune or made a bad business decision. It looks like the implication is he lost everything. And now there's nothing left for an inheritance. So he kept hoarding, kept trying to get more money. He loses it, and now he's kind of blown everything. So rather than using his riches for good, the man accumulated riches for just the sake of accumulating more riches. So not only do riches fail to satisfy and keep one from a restful sleep, they can actually harm the owner. They have become a source of sorrow and pain in this case. And the principle is still there: death terminates all wealth. No person has ever bought security, ever. You've heard the saying, you can't take it with you. I don't know if you've ever heard this old joke before about the person said, well, I'm going to take it with me, and when you bury me, stuff all the money into the coffin. And there was a person up there kind of removing money out of the coffin at the funeral, and somebody said, hey, what are you doing? He said, it's okay, I wrote a check. Yeah. So those who grabbed and rose to the top will ultimately release and drop to the bottom. It's like, at the end of the day, we came into the world with nothing, and that's how we're all going to leave. And so all these different stations in life and all these different things, at the end of the day, we're all going out the same. And you might have the most toys, but you can't take your toys with you. It's not going to do you any good. This too is a grievous evil. As everyone comes, so they depart, and what do they gain, since they toil for the wind? All their days they eat in darkness with great frustration, affliction, and anger. This is what I have observed to be good, that it's appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life God has given them, for this is their lot. So he kind of continues the thought here of we come into the world with nothing, we leave the world with nothing, so really what's the gain at the end of the day? We all kind of leave at the same balance sheet. The darkness he refers to there is probably a metaphor for gloominess, probably suggests the kind of life they're living in sorrow and dejection, probably have a heavy heart. That little phrase there, that it is appropriate, could be translated good and fitting in some versions. Actually, the rendering is good and beautiful, which kind of implies a a personal satisfaction there in that particular phrase. And then Solomon says, this is what I have observed. It's kind of like, I've asked this question before and I've arrived at a similar conclusion. This isn't the first time I've kind of explored this, and I'm kind of coming to the same place, the same answer. To find personal satisfaction in one's labor and the joys of living is the reward available to men. And so again, this is not the first time he's told us this or pointed this out to us. And again, he lets us know that it's a gift from God. It's kind of like, so as we live out our lives, enjoy ourselves, laugh more, find pleasure in the simple things. I was thinking about that. When Tam and I were first married, we lived in the dorms. And so we worked in the dorms. Part of that was I had a 2-bedroom furnished apartment, so we had a place to live. We had a little bit of money. We went to movies, we went to shows, we went to class, we were able to go to the butcher. We had enough, we could buy a couple of steaks each week when we went to the butcher and stuff. But at that time in life, it's like you just can't wait to, adult, can't wait till we graduate and get out of here and, and make big salaries, blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes you look back and you realize, that really wasn't a bad time in life. That was really pretty simple. And you didn't think you had a whole lot, but you didn't seem to be hurting for stuff. You had a lot of good things that happened, so. It is interesting how things we think will bring more to satisfaction, sometimes it's the simple things that we remember. So refuse to get caught up in the greed trap, to attach yourself to the dollar sign, to place top priority on making more, just to make more. So that seems to be the message here. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift of God. They seldom reflect on the days of their life because God keeps them occupied with gladness of heart. If your wealth and possessions are indeed a gift from God, you can actually enjoy it, and it makes you happy because God permits it. Consider yourself blessed or fortunate. So again, he says God is going to bless some people with wealth and possessions, and if that's you and God's blessed you that way, have the right attitude about it, use it the right way, and enjoy the gift. Again, riches and wealth aren't evil of themselves, and that's kind of really what this verse the fact that this would seem to indicate God gives them to some. So we see that there are some of those. And I was thinking about this, certainly people in our brotherhood have been blessed in different ways in their ability to contribute larger amounts to things like to support Christian universities, to support mission work and different things like that, to support good causes, benevolent causes, different ways to reach out. So certainly there are examples where people have been blessed with wealth and have been able to use it in a way that still gives them joy and doesn't get them caught up in the chasing money routine. Our present life can be rewarding and filled with joy, and one way to accomplish this is to be busy doing what God desires. So saying, we can be joyful. We don't need other things to fill a void necessarily. And the bonus of this approach is you don't have to be caught up in the past experiences of your life because you don't view life as long and tedious. You don't dwell on the past or future troubles because you're content with the good things God has given you. And you're able to freely and cheerfully enjoy them, which allows you to pass away your time with delight and pleasure. So it's kind of like he boils it down to be a good steward with what God has given you. The right perspective brings gladness of heart. And so, again, he's given us a lot of thoughts about money and wealth. Let's go ahead. If there's no comments on chapter 5, we'll move into chapter 6. Okay. I've seen another evil under the sun, and it weighs heavily on mankind. God gives some people wealth, possession, and honor so that they lack nothing their hearts desire. But God does not grant them the ability to enjoy them, and strangers enjoy them instead. This is meaningless, a grievous evil. So Solomon has painted a lot of portraits, if you will, of different people, as we've kind of gone through the book so far. In chapter 6, he starts off here. You could almost say this is like a self-portrait. In some ways, it's like a look at himself. He does use the reference to mankind, so it implies he's also has a broader message here, not just perhaps just not talking about himself, but making this applicable to others as well. On the surface, it looks like a man who has everything. wisdom, wealth, power, and pleasure, but he's also the man who has nothing, an unfulfilled desire for love, enjoyment, satisfaction, contentment. In other words, he's still looking for meaning. Still looking for meaning. Philosopher Immanuel Kant had a saying, give a man everything he wants, and at that moment, everything will not be everything. We've talked about that, the insatiable appetite, is there ever enough? And even if you had everything, it would no longer be everything. But then Solomon says, God does not give him the power to enjoy them. Enjoyment of life doesn't come from increased possessions, but as the gift of God. And we've seen him talk about that in a couple different places, where enjoyment comes from. Solomon's talked about this too. So we see Solomon kind of continue to talk about the futility of riches. Solomon talks of God's involvement in two ways. He says God gives some people wealth, and then two, God does not grant them the ability to enjoy it. The first one's certainly easier to understand than the second one. So if we talk about the second one, God does not grant them the ability to enjoy it. Some thoughts on maybe what's meant there. It may be that God doesn't permit it simply because God's laws won't permit to find such joy. God has ordained that personal fulfillment and joy are only to be found within the confines he has established. So one who chooses to live outside such an area may be able to gather and collect great amounts of wealth, but will not be able to genuinely enjoy it. So a couple different ways we could look at that, but maybe that's what it is, that God's kind of given the parameters. If you're within the parameters, you do have the ability to enjoy it, but you go outside, you try to do things on your own, you go outside the parameters God has given, then you're not able to enjoy them. A man may have 100 children and live many years, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. It comes without meaning, it departs in darkness, and in darkness its name is shrouded. Though it never saw the sun or knew anything, it has more rest than does that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice over, but fails to enjoy his prosperity, do not all go to the same place. So now it kind of adds the other piece. Will adding many children make life more satisfying? And so Solomon's assertion here is that long life and a large family without the gift of enjoyment cannot bring satisfaction to life. And that, in some ways that probably seems a little counter to our thinking, but even a long life with many children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will not in and of it themselves provide man's deep need and hunger for contentment. And from there, Solomon makes kind of a striking statement that the stillborn baby is better off. And it sounds pretty shocking at first, and then he kind of explains what he means. It's like, the baby has no history to regret. The baby will never experience pain, sadness, and sorrow, but the rich man will. The baby and the man of wealth who lives a long life will both go to the same place, the grave, with neither knowing the enjoyment of life that God intended. Solomon also made a statement that the man of wealth whose soul is never satisfied with life's good things may also have no burial. In this context, that would have been a disgrace. The only people that weren't buried were the enemies of Israel, are those who were viewed as the despicable members of society. They were left without burial. In other words, they were just kind of left out on the ground for all the animals and the predators and stuff to devour. So it's almost like no one cared when this person was gone and no one took care of his burial, which again is a little bit hard for us to imagine, because that, even in our society, even, people that we don't know, we all think, we want to give them some kind of burial, even if we know nothing about them. So that part's a little bit different. We are at the end. We will pause there. I think, Jeff, if I remember right, Willie starts next week. So we've got a little bit of a break again. Willie Hunter will be in here next week, and then we'll come back and get into, actually the next 4 weeks, and then we'll come back into Ecclesiastes and keep going. We'll probably have to extend some, because we're not going to get through chapter 12 but in a few more lessons. So we'll just kind of keep going and fill in here and there. So thank you again for your attention and for everything, and we'll see you next time.